more a comment perhaps from Brodie. I think, while I agree with everything you said, I do want to point out that it's your whole presentation was incredibly normative. It was not as you also alluded to several times, it's not descriptive of how debriefing works in the general art community, or indeed how some of these words are used. So bleed, for instance, is used quite loosely also for positive emotional transfer between games and wanted emotional transfer between games and after games. So I think if I could just ask you again to just reflect on, I guess, the viability of getting these words to mean what you want them to mean. And I agree, this would be fantastic if this is what art debriefing actually meant, but that's not how the words are used today. So how do you see that progression in that direction?
Can you restate that? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so today art debriefing, as you yourself pointed out, means all kinds of things. It's used very loosely. And I think I agree with you that it should mean what you want it to mean. How do we get there?
Well, I can say from my experience with American campaign games is training, I think. There's a fascination, I think, in the people I've talked to with getting to the spot where we can do it reliably. But people not knowing what has been shown to work and not testing that to see what works. So, I mean, that's actually the challenge that I have moving forward is bringing up that level of consciousness in which debriefing is seen as a valuable tool and LARPing is done consciously. Right now, I mean, the standard practice is an opt-in debrief. And I think making it a more normative part of the experience, which is what I've seen elsewhere with it being a necessary part of the design, is part of how we get to that spot. That combined with people doing, I guess, conscious work against war storying. I mean, that's the biggest thing that I run into, and that's a lot of the people I'm working with haven't done it before. I'm novice in it, and the level of consciousness for like LARP terms like bleed and war storying and stuff isn't there. So
okay, then my follow-up question is: can you talk a little bit about why war storying? What do you mean by that, and why is it bad?
Oh, okay. So yeah, so with war storying, that's constructing a narrative about what one has done in a game in a way where you are reconstituting your actions in words, but it's usually done for the sake of valorizing oneself or to express in monologue. The benefit of doing debriefing socially is that you do create a dialogue with the people who have affected you, and you're also willing to make yourself emotionally vulnerable to explore feelings. War storying is usually something done, again, to construct it's valorous, and it's done to construct a single narrative that doesn't beget reflection, but just packages up an event that's happened. I think the individualistic culture of American boffer games, which is, again, just not necessarily where I want to work entirely, but where I am right now, doesn't lend to identity construction. It leads to desiring to sharing oneself valorously again, and without opportunity for input or vulnerability.
Thank you. More questions?
A question for Stephen, and I think this is probably coming from a misunderstanding of mine of your presentation. So you studied a group of home LARPers, so you were more specific in the actual style of game you were playing, and sort of found that they were learning lots of different things and were effective on lots of things they were learning. However, I'm curious if you have any sense of the chicken or egg problem, right? Are these people who already have these skills or have some interest in them or are genetically disposed towards them that are then drawn towards these kinds of activities where they can succeed and be successful and sort of shine, or is it the other way around where they had no skills, played the game, and felt better?
Well, many of these, so about half of the participants in the study started playing LARP when they were in the range of 15 to 18 years old. So they knew nothing about really really about leadership other than, they'd experienced in school, and attributed playing in LARPs to their developing an understanding of it. Of the other participants, they described themselves as people who felt very uncomfortable in groups, who felt very uncomfortable as leaders of groups, and got dragged into LARPs by friends, or they heard about it, or a housemate was doing it, so they tried it, and they started having fun in it, and they kept coming back. And one participant said, I was afraid of groups, I was afraid of leadership, and now I consult to groups and I teach people how to lead. So, I don't know if that quite answers your question. Given the nature of a qualitative study, this sampling method is called purposeful sampling, deliberately seeking out people who have the experience. This study can't really address, other than to the extent that I just said, whether or not they would have been drawn to it anyway.
I was thinking about, I'm sorry, I don't remember your name. Graham. I was thinking about what you were saying, and then also the last person.
My name's Brodie.
Brodie, thank you. Now, I was wondering, in your view of the improv and the director-teacher role, are they do you see them as a participant in the improv in terms of debriefing afterward, or can they act as the facilitator?
The director-teacher role is someone who sets aside from, usually sets aside from the players, or actors, or whatever you want to call them. And that has a few advantages and a few disadvantages. I know of improv game groups which don't follow that model, which actually have the teacher director being a member of the playing group. But I've not played in one of those groups, and I can totally see the value of having a separate role.
So,
improv games and debriefing are totally unconnected, and I think they should be connected.
So Moreno is integral to understanding improv as well as role-playing and LARPing. And in sociodrama, you have a similar role, the role of the director, whose job is to be spontaneously engaged with the group, but also maintaining some executive understanding of what the group is building to. Again, it's like the facilitator role. It's unburdening those who are involved so they can engage with it spontaneously. And the role of that director is to watch for themes within their spontaneity in addition to lessons that they want to be taught. So I think that having that role, right, that's what you're asking about, is how the role, that role is very useful, and also part of what makes, that's another part of the distinction between debriefing and war storying, is that there is facilitation in a debrief, and the ability to, even if someone gets to a spot where they are speaking, they're speaking in monologue, they're speaking in an unreflective way, someone who is there to then potentially prompt the question, like, your character succeeded in this by hurting this person, like, why did you do that, and was there a better option? That is getting into the role of more long-term, I think, therapeutic and corrective work, which I mean, given my degree, I think it's a viable way of moving with things, but that's the role of it, and it's related, again, in allowing people to access their spontaneity while paying attention to the themes.
I brought this up because in the nursing simulations that we do, it's often the faculty member whose students are participating in the simulation who is going to be facilitating the debriefing, depending on what kind of debriefing model you use within your institution, their own training. But I find also that because the faculty member is often, depending on how you do it, they're often part of the simulation as well, because they're playing various roles. They may be playing the charge nurse when the younger nurses come in, or the less experienced nurses come in and need to ask a question. They may be playing the role of the instructor as they go through that. And I wondered about the impact of them, if you're getting it as good, as much out of the debriefing as you could, as if you had a separate facilitator who is an observer and not directly interacting during the simulation.
Yes, that's a tactic they do in group therapy, to have co-therapists, and I think would be very valuable for doing that, to have someone both engage with it, to be enacting, doing an authentic enactment, and also someone observing, and then exchanging that information through their debrief.
Thank you. Both.
I have a question for you, Brodie. So you evoked the terms critical incident stress management, psychological first aid. Professionally, my background is disaster preparedness consulting. And so one thing I do is design and conduct disaster exercises for governments and corporations. So I see a lot of parallels between a disaster exercise and a LARP. One thing disaster exercises can be very intense and stressful experiences, and they do have a debriefing. They call it a hot wash, but it's mainly designed. The primary purpose for it is not from a mental health standpoint, but it's from let's collect information on what processes need to be improved upon, and what processes were identified as strengths that we need to make sure that we maintain that. So the good and the bad. My question, I guess, in this long setup is, here you have a very stressful exercise that can be very immersive, and yet there hasn't been identified a need for a mental health debriefing as part of the exercise. At least having done this for over 10 years now, I'm not aware of anything in that area. We definitely use it in disasters from a critical incident stress management or psychological first aid standpoint for both responders and victims in a disaster scenario, but we don't use it in our exercises. Now, there has been an identified need for that type of intervention in immersive LARPs. And I'm wondering if you have any ideas of do you have any thoughts on why you think it's a need for one and hasn't been identified as a need for the other, where you have so many similarities? I have some thoughts on it, but I'm just curious if you've run across anything, and especially since some of your research touched on some of the response mental health interventions.
So there's a quote that I've held on to for a long time from Kevin Burns in the 2014 WeirdCon Compendium, where he said, like, LARP is about how you feel. LARP is an effective thing, I think, because while when you debrief in educational situations, you start with the effective. You start with how it affected you, and people often regard emotions as being pre-rational. In LARP, you're often playing with feelings, and that's your goal, is to experience those feelings. So I think that's why that has that locus. And some LARPs take on, you're agreeing, you're consenting to be in the situation, but you go through things that, again, with the dual process theory, all those automatic processes you have, say that you're dying, your loved one is dead, and you subject yourself to that, regularly, and then I think that's why that doesn't have that cognitive component to it. If you're doing the simulations, again, for the sake of learning, then that's why I think that comes primarily. That's what is done in simulation games, but it is involved in the literature that I read with doing educational debriefing, that you do start with the effective. I think the difference, now I'm just restating, but I think the difference is that in LARP, you are usually, when you institute a debrief, it's just to correct things emotionally.
I'd like to jump in on this for a moment, if I may, because this is actually an issue that I've seen and I've addressed in the past. So I've run LARPs for professional groups. And debriefing with a professional group is a different thing than with sort of a random group of people. So if you're working with a professional group, be it disaster simulation, which I've occasionally done, they are people who are already trained to some degree, and they're coming in to figure out how to apply training, how to use training, how to understand what's happening, but they're already experts in whatever they do. They're not just a group of players who've come together and who essentially don't have the psychological defenses that come with, I know what I'm doing in this field, I'm playing in this game in order to test it under pressure, which is, I think, a different situation. But then the other thing that comes up that I have to ask is, what sort of LARPs are creating trauma? So if you're having someone who's having a traumatic experience in a LARP, we have to look at, is it the LARP or is it the person? And I can think of one particular example where a player, not that we had any such terms as bleed, this was back in 1984, had a very bad reaction in a LARP, which involved a many-year vendetta directed at other players. Now, was this a function of the LARP, or was it schizophrenia? Turned out it was schizophrenia. The person had a psychotic break about 10, 12 years after graduating from college. Probably had had one previously that no one knew about, because the first one was late enough that there was probably at least one other. But essentially, nothing would have prevented that. Nothing would have prevented that reaction to the LARP, because it was, essentially it was a time bomb waiting to happen, or it was a trap waiting to be sprung. It was just some stressful event was going to trigger that.
That is what Sarah Bowman has also advocated, that usually we debrief for intense emotions. It's not because LARPs have traumatized us, but because they have triggered traumas within us. I personally, sometimes the framework of a LARP can be such an ideological filter for like how people treat you and stuff. I'm still not sure about that, but that is a prevailing part of how Sarah processes debrief.
Just a moment to jump in. It's often very difficult to justify to authorities to give budget for emotional debriefings, to training exercises for firefighters or disaster responders of any sort, just because it's qualitative outcome instead of quantitative outcome. And if it's not numbers, it's difficult to get money behind it.
Also,
Sorry, I'm just going to chime in. I would, kind of back to your statement and stuff, and why we don't use it in that format, thinking about people and their stress and the environment stuff that's going on. Harvard has a model for debriefing. During their training and education, we go to have a psychologist on staff to work with the participants, because it can be that stress, can create that stress and bring feelings of incidences in the past up to them and things like that. And my statement would be is we don't know, but why don't we try it and put them in there, and it would be good research, if nothing else, to find out if it's somewhat beneficial. Because with the incident rates of suicides and like firefighting and EMS personnel and things like that, you could get money to pay for it. And
Yeah, and I would think that there's probably not a good understanding of maybe the impact of exercises on professionals. My knee-jerk reaction would be to go with what Steve said, and that, hey, we're trained in this, we know what to expect. Mentally, we are prepared for what we're encountering in the exercise. But the reality of it is sometimes you get new folks that come into these exercises that have only been on the job for a couple of weeks and may not have that level of preparedness that someone that's been working in the field for 10, 20 years has. So then I like what Brodie said, in that really a lot of LARPs are kind of exploring those deep emotional impacts, and that's not necessarily the purpose of a lot of disaster exercises, is to explore the emotions of death and loss and some of those things that I know especially a lot of freeform LARPs delve into. But no, it's just thinking about that and the correlations. I like looking at the kind of the comparison of LARP with disaster exercises.
And I could recommend a bridge between both those different areas. Hey, Danny, in the Army, I was a course manager for Special Operations at Fort Bragg, Special Warfare Center at school, work with civil affairs, which we do disaster management, disaster preparedness, stuff like that, where we train soldiers in these scenarios where they experience, it's like a LARP, training scenario, they're a soldier in a fictitious country doing their jobs. And in certain situations, they experience immense, it's very tenuous exercises, so that they're experiencing very problematic situations like human trafficking, war crimes, things of that nature. And we have psychologists on
the onset of trauma.
I also
Can you do that
just want to
without
say that.
addressing the emotions?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Well, of course, if you play in a game and you enjoy it and you have a good time and you overcome obstacles, you will, remember the comment, people become as they are treated as being. If you have that experience and translate it back to the real world, you'll develop more resilience. And I think this also goes back to the idea of, I mean, part of why people tell war stories is that they are reframing the high points of the game in a way that builds their own confidence.
Yeah, I think the hardest part of disaster preparedness is just getting people to recognize that there's a need. I don't think there's a perception of a need currently. Now, is there the reality for a need for post-exercise mental health debriefings? That's another question, and perhaps that's worth studying. But getting even people to recognize that there may be, and I think from a actual response standpoint, there's certainly some resiliency that needs to be built in there, as seen in the literature and suicide rates and whatnot.
Well, and as far as identifying a need, I think a lot of the data, if I'm understanding this correctly, a lot of the data to be able to highlight that's already there. If you're looking at the tendency of suicide in first responders.
Well, for building,
Actually, I have something that may be helpful for this.
Yeah.
So the debrief discourse right now, there are many studies done, starting in 1999 is one that people cite often, another one in 2002 or 2005, that show a harmful effect to debrief. And seemingly at that point, a lot of debrief studies in that style cut off. There have been a few recently, in the past 2 years or so. In the time between 2002 and now, within debrief discourse, there were many proposed methodologies for how to study debrief, but seemingly no one who would take it on because of the burden of having some studies behind it that show it may be harmful. Even though those studies in the discourse, which it's taken 10 years of talking about it to get to say like, oh, that was actually probably not a very good study. I think that's also why it's been removed. So even things like psychological first aid are not backed with evidence, but are, what do they say, like based on expert opinion and expert review. So the Red Cross still practices that.
Yeah, well, sure. I mean, that's something that's taught all the time. And you've definitely seen a shift away from critical incident stress management, which does a lot to potentially reinforce negative memories. And they say it's still potentially effective, at least my understanding is it's still potentially effective within trained personnel like first responders, but not an effective mechanism for the community. And so you've seen this shift away from that towards psychological first aid and providing that to people in the community. And that's a more supportive type intervention as opposed to debriefing and reinforcing memories. But yeah, that's kind of what we've seen in the disaster response, is that shift away from critical incident stress management and more of a focus on psychological first aid. Yeah.
Well, that's something that might be worthwhile for you to take a look at. You were talking about the research and stuff behind debrief, and most specifically you mentioned psychological first aid. Hold on, but in my last presentation, I had given my educational background. I had actually just finished my second master's in clinical mental health counseling last May. And so one of the classes that I ended up taking was on crisis management. And there's a book that we used for that by James and Gilliland, 2013, and then a Crandall, Parnell, and Spilly in 2014. Crisis intervention strategies, which I believe that's the blue one. That is the book that actually goes into more like the evidence base behind the effectiveness of psychological first aid and debriefing as well.
Okay.
And so some of the positives that have been come out of the literature as far as and studies that for that particular strategy.
Okay, cool.